Welcome to the Department of English, Literature and Creative Writing's 8th annual Priory Lecture on Religion and Literature. This evening's distinguished speaker is Abdul-Rehman Malik, who is a writer, broadcaster, teacher and curator, whose work connects faith, culture, storytelling and community building. Currently based in the Divinity School at Yale University in the States, where he is a lecturer in Islamic studies. He serves both as the program coordinator for cultural literacy at Yale's Council on Middle East Studies and as director of the Muslim Leadership, a student program. The rich diversity of his creative life informs the international range of his work. Abdul-Rehman, or AR, as he is happy to be known, has also worked in Canada, the UK, Pakistan, Indonesia, and Morocco, etc. As a broadcaster, he's been a frequent contributor to BBC 2, 3, and 4, reflecting memorably on culture and spirituality and the medieval depiction of Christ in particular. In addition, he has made a major contribution to the annual Greenbelt Festival, a celebration of art, faith and justice down south, which his talks are characterised by wit, warmth and wisdom. Of particular relevance for tonight's lecture, AR was creative advisor to the English touring theatre's acclaimed reimagining of Othello 2016-2019, and he curated the Othello Project, a festival of artistic response to the production. Abdul-Rehman Malik has an especial gift for relating both the spiritual and the cultural to everyday experience. He speaks eloquently from within his own Islamic tradition, but also gives a vivid and hopeful insight into the possibilities of a world that is ready to think itself through religious fault lines. Friends, colleagues, students, please welcome Abdul-Rehman Malik.
Soft you, a word or two before you go. I have done the state some service and they know it. No more of that, I pray you, in your letters. When you shall see these unlucky deeds relate, speak of me as I am, nothing extenuate, nor set down aught in malice. Then you must speak of one that loved not wisely but too well, of one not easily jealous, but being wrought, perplexed in the extreme, of one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away, richer than all of his tribe, of one whose subdued eyes, albeit unused to the melting mood, drop tears as fast as the Arabian trees their medicinal gum. Set you down this and say besides, that in Aleppo once, where a malignant and turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him such. At the end of his tragic arc, Shakespeare's Othello offers this final speech before taking his own life, reflecting on his sense of identity, service, love, and betrayal. He sees himself as a man who's loved deeply but not wisely, someone who's ultimately overwhelmed by jealousy and manipulation. It is this reference to the malignant and turbaned Turk that has haunted me since I reacquainted myself with Othello several years ago. A lot has been said about this last monologue that Othello gives before stabbing himself, destroying himself, killing himself, effacing himself in this great finality for the guilt that he feels at the murder of his wife Desdemona. But in my bones, in my sinews, in my heart, I might even say in my DNA, I knew there was something much more going on here. The reference to the malignant and turbaned Turk as he strikes himself isn't just about a man who is taken by guilt or realizes himself a victim of passion, but rather Othello echoes the cultural, racial, and religious anxiety embedded in his identity throughout the play and reflective of the time he lived in, and frankly reflective of the time that we live in. Othello in this last moment is no longer merely the loyal soldier who serves the Venetian state, but a man who recognizes the forces that have reduced him to this tragic end, forces that have racialized and dehumanized him as a Moor, forever an outsider and forever dangerous. In this moment of Othello's tragic unraveling, I see, and tonight I offer you an invitation to see the way in which societies, systems, and structures dehumanize and isolate particular bodies and destroy them from the inside first, and then make them out to be creatures of violence. Tonight, I'm going to ask you to join me in reflecting on that character of the Moor who walks among us today, the Muslim male body. What does the Muslim male body have to do with us right now? I want to reflect with you in the next few moments that we have together on the moment that we have all been living in over these past 12, 13 months. We are witness for the first time in the history of humanity to mass death, genocide being broadcast to us real time. If you and I are not feeling heavy by this witness, I question our humanity. Because the heaviness of this moment is something that I am carrying into our conversation tonight. The mere ability that we have to observe mass death unfolding a world away has created a disorienting and emotionally exhausting reality. And I say that as a Muslim man who is a product of the 9/11 generation. I came of age as a journalist and as an organizer in the aftermath of the 7/7 bombings in London. I learned very quickly something that I had known from a young age, that as a Muslim male body, I was not looked at in the same way as other bodies were looked at. While white male violence and predation are ubiquitous and often normalized, the Muslim male body has come to represent and embody the pathologies of masculinity in particularly piquant and dangerous forms and ways. This perception continues to haunt our global narratives today as we see in the dehumanization of the Palestinian man. One of the things that I felt in the days after the terrible events of October 7th was the way in which media began covering the deaths of Palestinians in Gaza, the murder of Palestinians in Gaza. You and I both remember that in those early days, as the shock, awe, and horror of the scale of the Israeli response on Gaza became clear, that the statistics that we were confronted with was again highlighting the deaths of women and children. This seemed consistent with narratives of death, particularly in war zones. And yet, I was left uncomfortable. Women and children, yes, but what of Palestinian men? What about those men we were seeing in pictures and hospitals, plowing through rubble, trying to save people, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, teachers? It was like they didn't exist, or at least weren't worthy of being talked about. At my own university, Yale, our university president at the time released a statement on the 10th of October, bemoaning the loss of life on the 7th of October, and added a line mourning the loss of non-militant Palestinians. The implication to me certainly was clear. Palestinian life only mattered when it could be qualified as non-militant. And who, of course, were the militant Palestinians, but all those men who might be members of Hamas or other political, military, or resistance movements. Maya Mikdashi in Jadaliyah wrote several years ago, at another poignant moment in the unfolding Gaza tragedy, which of course did not begin on October 7th, she noted that the massifying of women and children into an indistinguishable group brought together by the sameness of gender and sex reproduces the Palestinian body and the male Arab body more generally as always already dangerous. And thus the status of male Palestinians as civilians is always circumspect. It's a deeply troubling framing. It's so troubling, in fact, because when we dig down and we begin to recognize what is going on here, we are seeing a process of systematic dehumanization. It brought me back to Othello again. In the play, as Shakespeare has written it, Othello's value to the Venetian state is as a great general, as a strategist, as a disciplined soldier who's able to lead his army to victory and to greatness. Against who? He is a Moor, converted to Christianity, taken into slavery from Africa, sold and sold, suffering great ignominy, battling through the most fantastical challenges, being brought into the Christian fold, but never being fully accepted for who he was. In his final moments, he doesn't refer to himself as a servant of Christ. He doesn't refer to himself as a servant of the Venetian state, but as the malignant and turbaned Turk. What's missing from our narratives, and what is the cost of erasing people's humanity? The erasure and dehumanization of the racialized Muslim male body, of the racialized Palestinian body, is, in my mind, part of a long-standing narrative of Muslim male bodies as dangerous and ultimately disposable. Whether through outright omission or implicit framing, this kind of manhood is denied the right to be mourned, not only as civilians, but as human beings, because their humanity is reduced and measured by whether or not they are a threat. And so Muslim the Muslim male body in times of conflict becomes particularly questionable as a human being. And these are narratives and stories which are told to us in our literature. At the intersection of the conversation around Muslimness, maleness, Islam, politics, religion, and the moment, in this nexus, in this ecosystem of ideas, we have evidence after evidence to show the way in which our narratives reinforce this dehumanization and therefore create the conditions necessary for erasure, so that we can see and be witness to mass organized death, and that our eyes and hearts are able to excuse and set aside the deaths of some because at some level we think they are dangerous, because we think they are terrorists, because we think they are individuals who will cause us harm and therefore no longer have the right to live. When I was approached several years ago by my dear friend Richard Twyman to take another look at Othello, he asked me a very simple and almost innocent question. He said, "Do you think Othello is a Muslim?" And I didn't have to think very long about that question because the answer to me was clear. Ever since I'd first read the play as a high school student, I always thought Othello was a Muslim, because I was reading the language of Moore in its historical context. Because in Shakespeare's time, Moore meant one thing. It meant those who had been living and creating civilization in the Iberian Peninsula. Moore meant those who had come from Africa and who professed La ilaha illallah, there is no God but God, and that Muhammad is the messenger of God. At the time that Shakespeare wrote and first performed Othello, the Iberian Peninsula was considering its final solution for the Moriscos, those people who had been forcibly converted to Catholicism. Because the Pope and the papal authority, even hundreds of years after the conversion of these people who were Muslim and now were something else, could not accept, this is an important point I want you to hold on to because we're going to come back to it, could not accept the idea that one could in one's full heart accept Christ into their lives if they had been Muslim before, or if they had Muslim in their genetics. There was a genetic, spiritual DNA problem. And Spain was under incredible pressure to deal with its Morisco problem. That's the history. That's the important historical context in which Othello emerges. In our production of Othello through English Touring Theatre, we imagined an Othello at the very nexus of what W.E.B. Du Bois would have called double consciousness. Outwardly Christian and a member of the Venetian polity, inwardly holding on to his Islam and his learning. We know from Othello's own testimony when he's speaking sweetly to Desdemona that he speaks about his noble upbringing. He speaks about his education. He speaks about his cosmopolitan identity. He speaks about the fact that he can communicate in multiple languages. Othello is a Renaissance figure at the heart of a Venetian state that is looking inward upon itself and its own power. And historically, we know Venice was the first city to establish Jewish ghettos. The first ghetto was established in Venice. We know that up until today, it is illegal to build mosques in Venice. When the Icelandic entry into the Venice Biennale several years ago attempted to convert an abandoned and unused church into a mosque space as an arts project, the Venetian City Council shut it down within 2 weeks. The Venice of Othello clearly has not vanished. From the very opening pages of Othello, we are confronted with a dis-ease that the people around him have towards him. Not because he's dishonest, not because he's a bad general, not because he's an immoral person. In fact, he is the exact opposite of all those, and everyone recognizes it. But when Iago approaches the house of Brabantio, Desdemona's father, what ugly language he uses. Your daughter and the Moor are now making the beast with two backs. Even now, very now, an old black ram is tupping your white ewe. The grotesque imagery is that while Othello is in the service of the state, he is acceptable. The moment he chooses to express the fullness of his humanity, to fall in love with someone who loves him back, his place within the society becomes suspect. Brabantio exclaims, "Damned as thou art, thou hast enchanted her, for I'll refer me to all things of sense, if she in chains of magic were not bound. Whether a maid so tender, fair, and happy, so opposite to marriage, that she shunned the wealthy and curled darlings of our nation, would have ever to incur a general mock, run from her guardage to the sooty bosom of such a thing as you, to fear, not to delight." This is the same Brabantio who invited Othello into his home to tell stories. We're very good at telling stories, aren't we? The minstrel quality of the black racialized man, of the Moor, is thoroughly acceptable. We can tell fantastic stories, can't we, about Africa and about the wonderful things that we saw and the languages that we speak and the mythology that we know and of the sacred books that we can offer because it's entertainment. It's an hour on Netflix. We wrap things up when we go to bed. While he was entertaining and leading and fighting, Othello was all right. But the moment he stepped out of that role, the moment he dared to be human, the moment he dared to love and be loved in return, he was suspect. Underlying this, of course, is a deep misogyny. A misogyny that Othello is not acquainted with until honest Iago shows up. I know our country disposition well, he tells Othello. In Venice, they, speaking of the women of Venice, they do let God see the pranks they dare not show their husbands. Their best conscience is not to leave it undone, but to keep it unknown. In Iago's manipulation of Othello, there is an effacement of an essential morality. The dehumanization is in the image of the dehumanizer. We are made to be inhuman. Othello is made to erase his humanity. In what image? In the image of the way the one who's shaping the story sees inhumanity. And how does Iago see inhumanity? Through the worst of the society that he comes from. Because that's all he knows. He doesn't know where Othello comes from. He doesn't know the civilizations of Africa and the Arab and Muslim lands. He doesn't know their mythologies, their stories, their sacred texts. He doesn't care. But he assaults Othello, effaces Othello. And in the end, Othello falls prey, of course, to the latent patriarchal impulses, the sense of male violence and predation that is a current in all of our societies, no doubt. But Othello acts on it in the way only a Venetian would. Because my argument would be that if Othello had grown angry out of the nexus of his own morality, the end of this play would have been different. I want us to consider Othello against the backdrop of real-world dehumanization. We don't need only to stop at Gaza. Let us go back to the Iraq War, the images of Abu Ghraib. Muslim male bodies mocked, humiliated, systematically dehumanized. This dehumanization is not new. It's part of a long history of colonial and racial narratives that treat black and brown bodies as expendable and male bodies as particularly dangerous and inherently violent. I remember a few years ago, I was teaching a youth class that lasted almost a year. I was working with a group of young men in North London and Wembley. And I remember we were using drama and storytelling to really speak about the moment that we were in after the 7/7 bombings, heightened state of scrutiny, of intelligence, of surveillance. And I remember offering a piece of drama whose intent was to explore the experiences of these young men who I was spending time with every week to speak about their experiences of stop and search. And one of the questions I asked them, I said, what's your experience, in this time of being stopped in random places by law enforcement and being asked to show your identity or being asked about where you were going or being questioned about your motives of merely being out. And there was a kind of a ho-hum in the room, a kind of like, your question is sort of not a very poignant question for us. I was a bit surprised by that, and I said, why the ho-hum attitude to my inquiry? They said, Abdul-Rehman, we're stopped all the time. Like, we don't even talk about it anymore. At that point, one of them might have even pulled a yellow notice out of their bag and said, I just got this yesterday. I have a lot of them. When stop and search and surveillance becomes ubiquitous, something happens to the way you see yourself. If we're no longer outraged by our freedoms of movement and of discourse and our work in society as being surveilled, then at some point we see ourselves as inherently suspect. And we acknowledge that the systems around us see us as potential threats. The criminalization of the racialized Muslim body, the criminalization and the erasure of the Palestinian male body are linked by the same substance, the same systemic substance. I know this firsthand. Crossing borders, being present at protests or political gatherings, having your door knocked in the aftermath of a terrorist attack or a major act of violence, having a neighbor call security services because you hang out at home with your Muslim partner and spouse and receive Muslim guests and distribute a Muslim magazine. all of these experiences, at some level, are merely annoying, but actually underlie the acceptance of a larger narrative that is constructed through literature and culture. In her recent book, Shanila Khojamulji writes about the impossibility of Muslim boyhood. Not only is this the male Muslim body that is suspect, but that process of being suspect begins much earlier. Because every Muslim boy is a potential terrorist. Every Muslim boy is a potential danger to society. Every Muslim boy, if not properly educated, guided, given the right literature to read, might end up as a threat to the rest of us. And therefore, young Muslim men like Ahmed Muhammad, who in 2015 was arrested for having the audacity to build a clock at home and to bring it in to show his teacher, he becomes suspect. The 5-year-old boy in 2017 who was handcuffed in front of his parents and held for hours by airport security in the aftermath of the election of Donald Trump is later accused of being a potential security risk. And in 2016, the young Abdulaziz, a 7-year-old Muslim boy, is beaten on a school bus and called a terrorist, and very little is done afterwards. In the aftermath of the beginning of the organized mass death genocide in Gaza, we had students at the University of Vermont shot at. We had a young Palestinian boy knifed to death by someone, a neighbor, who could not conscience or stomach a Palestinian living within their apartment block. And just a few weeks ago, a young boy was run over, clearly, visually Arab and Muslim, run over by someone irate and angry at Palestinians and Muslims. Sheila Mulji says the construction of Muslim boys as proto-terrorists can properly be understood as a particular practice of racialization. It introduces impurity. I want you to hold on to that because we've said that before and we're going to come to it in just a second. It introduces an impurity, a threat in the subject by disavowing the imputed purity, innocence often associated with childhood. When innocence is denied to Muslim boys, they are refused permission to experiment or to make mistakes, which is something that we allow and want our children to do. Experimentation's relationship to boyhood as a developmental stage is complex. Boyhood evokes an expectation of experimentation and frivolity, but also the anticipation of discipline from adults. The particular construction of Muslim boyhood, she says, as a threat means that Muslim boys may well experience the disciplinary aspect of boyhood, but they do not have the permission to experiment. And I would add to say, they do not have the right to be creative. The erasure and the dehumanization of the black and brown Muslim body isn't something that only happens in adulthood or something that is only happening in Gaza, but is something that permeates our very culture. And I'm going to offer you two, I think, important cultural pieces to illustrate this. Ayad Akhtar's play Disgraced tells the story of a man named Amir, who is the protagonist. We're introduced to Amir in the play, which won the Pulitzer Prize, by the way. So I'm not offering you something marginal from the world of letters or literature. I'm offering you a celebrated piece of theater which came to this country and had sold out shows. I was at one of them, and I'll speak about that in a moment. Amir, the protagonist of Disgrace, initially represents a man who's fully assimilated into the fast-paced New York American society. He's a lawyer, successful corporate lawyer who's renounced his Muslim identity and even disavows his religion publicly. Early in the play, Amir's rejection of his Muslim heritage is evident when he tells his wife, who's a visual artist and who, at this point in her artistic career, has become fascinated by Islamic art, culture, and civilization. Amir tells her, why are you bothering with this Islam stuff? Quote, Islam is a backward way of thinking. It's tribal. His disdain for his birth religion is clear. And here is where the conflict is set up by Ayad Akhtar, the playwright. He wants to be part of a secular world that eschews religion. And yet the pages and action that follow show he cannot escape the weight of his Muslim identity. His nephew, who was born with a Muslim name but now calls himself Abe Jensen, comes to Amir and asks him to help defend an imam who is facing charges of funding terrorism. Amir initially refuses, warning his nephew about the consequences of being associated with such a case. And it reflects Amir's own desire to distance himself from Islam. He says to his nephew, you don't understand. I've worked very hard to get where I am. I'm not going to jeopardize that because of some imam. It's Emily, his wife, who comes to Amir and says, you're ashamed of who you are. You're ashamed of your own culture, and that shame is affecting us. It's interesting how Akhtar sets this up. The white American artist, liberal, open, progressive, is defending Islam, defending Islamic culture. In another part of the play, she says, what about Ibn Arabi and Mullah Sadra, great names in Islamic philosophy and mysticism? And she's the one who's being dismissed by her born Muslim husband. And yet, something happens in the play that is pernicious, and that is telling. And I want you to keep in mind what we talked about earlier, about the notion of an impurity that cannot be cleaned. A toxin or a way of being, something in your DNA that cannot go away. Because what Ayad Akhtar dangerously and Pulitzer Prize winningly offers us is this. Amir may try to run away from his religion, from his Muslimness, from his heritage. But ultimately, just like the lurking HIV virus, which is controlled by taking retrovirals, just like that, his Islam is like a virus. And he takes the retrovirals of liberalism, capitalism, success, extractive and exploitive economies, of being a legal eagle. And yet there'll come a moment where that HIV, that impurity, that virus, that trouble in your DNA will show up. Because the moment Amir is challenged, he doesn't get a promotion. The case with the imam starts going badly. The partners at the law firm start looking at him suspiciously. He finds out that his wife has had an affair with her art dealer. All of a sudden, what does Ayad Akhtar, the playwright, give us? Amir starts to talk about his pride in the attacks of 9/11. when he's challenged, why are you saying that? He talks about he not thinking it possible that his people could do this. Just before that, he was denying that these people were even his people. He becomes angry that because of this Muslimness he's being denied, and yet at the same time, Akhtar depicts a man who is now being overcome by a particular rage. The very things in the first half of the play that he was saying that Muslims, in inverted comma, are, he is now becoming. There's a moment, sort of the penultimate moment in the play, where he confronts his wife Emily over her infidelity. And I want to read you the stage directions, because you can always tell what a playwright is thinking by the stage directions. It's never in the words. How does a playwright want the actor to play? And this to me is revealing and disturbing. The stage direction reads, quote, "He hits her hard." I'll say that again because I didn't read it right. It's 2 sentences. He hits her, period. Hard, period. The first blow unleashes a torrent of rage overtaking him. He hits her twice more, maybe a third, in rapid succession, uncontrolled violence, as brutal as it needs to be in order to convey the discharge of a lifetime of discreetly building resentment. This moment of violence marks the unraveling of Amir's identity. Despite his efforts to assimilate and reject his Muslimness, the narrative implies that his violent outburst was always lurking beneath the surface, reinforcing the dangerous trope that Muslim men are inherently violent. Amir himself echoes this idea as he tells Isaac, his wife's lover, "You think I'm one of them, then that's what this is." This line draws a direct connection between Amir's violence and his Muslim identity, as if his assimilation was ever only a fragile facade. What's fascinating about this is that Othello appears again in Ayad Akhtar's play, Disgraced. Appears because we know the Moor is so associated with Othello. Emily, while all of this is going on, has been working on a painting of Amir. And the painting is of Amir dressed in a French uniform. And it mirrors a painting that depicted the Moor in French uniform. Instead of a Moor, it's Amir's face in this redrawing of the picture that Emily presents to him at the end of the play. Ultimately, the Moor appears again, the black, brown, Muslim, racialized other, the one who can never truly belong, the one who is prone to violence, the one whose humanity is questioned. In thinking about this, I was reminded of another important piece of literature from our cultural context. A remarkable short story which had a profound impact on me when I first read it, called My Son the Fanatic, by the British-Pakistani writer Hanif Qureshi. In My Son the Fanatic, we see a father-son dynamic unfold, and Muslim masculinity is again framed as inherently troublesome. Parvez, a cab driver, enjoys drinking, associating with prostitutes, and gambling, living a worldly life. His son Ali, however, rejects this and starts to turn to what Qureshi describes as a more stricter interpretation of Islam, which disturbs his father, who drives a taxi and wants something more for his son and sees Islam and Muslimness as a barrier to all of that, and he's rejected that in his own life. In this story, we see Ali, the son, Parvez, the father, find an inability to communicate They can't find middle ground. They can't find a shared humanity. There's judgment one way and the other, but Ali is a boy. Ali is a boy. He's experimenting. He's trying to find value and meaning where his father is not giving him any. And so Ali is concerned about his father's soul as many children are concerned about their parents. And Pervez is confused by this behavior. And he says, at the madrasa, they beat the children when they learn the Quran. Don't go there. Don't go to these places where they'll turn you into backward outcasts from society. I have done everything possible to not be that, and now you embrace it, my son. Pervez asks his son, what's going on in your head? Ali responds, accusing his father of being a failure and of being morally corrupt. Ali says to his dad, you are too implicated in Western ways. You're lost. Pervez's frustration with Ali's newfound religiosity mirrors so much of the tension that Amir feels in Disgraced. Both are trying to navigate their Muslim identities within these frameworks to which they do not and can never really fully belong. Frameworks that see their faith as inherently suspect. What happens at the end of my son the fanatic? Ali speaks to his dad, but Pervez can't take it anymore. The story culminates in an act of violence. Pervez, in a fit of frustration, beats Ali. Quote, Pervez kicked him over. Then he dragged the boy up by his shirt and hit him. The boy fell back. Pervez hit him again. The boy's face was bloody. Pervez was panting. He knew that the boy was unreachable, but he struck him nonetheless. The boy neither covered himself nor retaliated. There was no fear in his eyes. He only said through his split lip, he says to his father through his split lip, so, who's the fanatic now? So, who's the fanatic now flips the narrative, doesn't it? The story up until the point seems all about the son's extremism, but it's the father, the assimilated liberal Muslim, who lashes out in anger. These aren't marginal pieces of literature. They're at the very heart of our literary canon. Hanif Qureshi and Ayad Akhtar. Ayad Akhtar is the past president of the Pen Writers Association in the United States. Hanif Qureshi is one of the most celebrated writers of our generation. Both are Muslim in some way. You'd have to ask them. But they certainly feel that they can comment and speak about Muslim themes. So what are they amplifying to us? My contention is we haven't come very far from Othello. My contention is also these narratives are so ubiquitous, existing in so many ways around us, in plays, in novels, in television, in film, that the notion that the Muslim male racialized body is suspect actually is a thesis that almost doesn't require the need to be proven. It's all around us. Which brings me in these final moments to how do we confront these narratives of dehumanization which allow us to look at scenes of genocide and willfully or implicitly ignore the deaths of tens of thousands of people, and in particular ignore and minimize and efface and make small the deaths of Palestinian and Muslim men. I think that we're living in a moment where another generation is emerging, a generation of writers influenced by decolonial movements and movements towards intersectionality and movements that are recognizing our systems as not merely racist, but institutionally so, and committed to levels of oppression and marginalization that are baked in rather than things that can be removed. And I'd like to offer two, I wouldn't say correctives, but two emerging perspectives from the emerging canon. Last year, the playwright Mohammad Zain Dada had the premiere of his first play called Blue Mist at the Royal Court Theatre. Blue Mist is a wonderful play. It tells the story of three young men who gather, as many of us do, in shisha or hookah cafes, where we smoke the water pipe and have mocktails, eat kebabs. And that's what Jihad, Asif, and Rashid do in Blue Mist. In Blue Mist, Mohammad Zain Dada offers us a story not only of the shisha lounge as a third space where young British Pakistani Muslim men gather, but also a place where they negotiate their masculinity. In this case, the play concerns itself with Jihad, one of the three boys' dream, which is to become a journalist, something that I could relate to. He wins an award, a commissioning award, and he pitches the story of the young men who gather at his favorite shisha cafe, an ethnography of sorts, an investigation into the real lives of young Muslim men. And yet, what begins initially as an honest attempt to speak about the lived experience of young Muslim men buffeted by family issues, economic questions, education, quickly becomes a story about the way in which Jihad is being asked by his producers to depict these young people. The play has a brilliant lightness to it. There's scenes of almost magic realism where we enter into these fantastical moments where there's song and metaphor. In one of these moments, Jihad and his friends sing a parody of Mary Poppins as a spoonful of sugar, replacing the words with a spoonful of Muslims helps the news go down in the most alarming way. The story in ways is heartbreaking because when Fiona, Jihad's producer, speaks to him, she claims to want authenticity of voice and then demands a spicy story. A tale ultimately of what? Radicalization and danger. If you won't tell it, someone else will. Only you can tell it. Only you can be the interlocutor. To borrow from a certain type of politics, only you can be the native informant. And so Jihad caves in, trying for years to find a place in journalism. He goes ahead and produces a piece of work that, instead of complicating Muslim masculinity, reduces it to tropes and stereotypes. The friendship of the three boys doesn't last, and the hurt is deep. Because the radio production, according to the play, wins awards, Asif and Rashid find themselves excluded from work because of unvarnished things that they said to their friend, hoping that it would not be used in a way that would flatten them and dehumanize them. What's quite powerful about Mohammad Zain Dada's play is that There is a sense of engaging with Muslim masculinity right now in a way that's unvarnished, sometimes even unintelligible, but it forces us to go into a language and a world that because of our class, upbringing, background, we might not understand. And yet to engage with it in a way that is on its own terms and not on our terms. And there is in the play something that is powerful, a tenderness, a joy that these young men find with each other, a care for family and community. The other book, which I'll ask your indulgence with for a moment, is a fairly complicated and powerful novel. It's called Brother Alive. Maybe some of you have read it, by Zain Khalid. It came out in 2022. Of all the recommendations that I'll give you tonight in these words, I highly recommend Brother Alive by Zain Khalid. I have found it, in preparing for tonight's words, to be a remarkable and challenging piece of fiction, representing, I think, the energy of a new generation of fiction writers emerging from Muslim cultures and backgrounds. Deeply intersectional, deeply complicated, deeply confusing, and joyfully so. Authors who are unwilling to be defined in one way or the other. Brother Alive tells the story of an Imam Salim in Staten Island, New York, who is raising 3 orphan boys, each of a different ethnicity and background, Yusuf, Dayo, and Isul. The first part of the book is told by Yusuf. He narrates the book, and he talks about their caretaker, Imam Salim, who's a father figure to them. He's writing or dictating or narrating the first part of the book clearly to his child later in life and refers to Imam Salim as his grandfather. I want to read you a little passage about Imam Salim, and I think you'll understand why this book excited me so much. In the beginning, your grandfather, this is Yusuf speaking to his child about Imam Salim. In the beginning, your grandfather, Imam Salim, observed a great many rituals as if hailing from an empire. Minutes before sunrise, he would call the jinns to prayer. After Fajr, the morning prayer, he'd enjoy a smoky coffee, a date, and a half grapefruit while reading the international section of the New York Times or eventually the Daily Star. Once the coffee emptied his systems, he began his exercises in his prayer room. He bent and contorted and stretched himself into positions that pitted gravity and his body weight against his muscles, freezing his limbs this way and that, the kinds of things a cat burglar might do to keep his wits. Limber and fatigued, he showered, then he would trim his beard to an invariably uniform 2.5 inches long, a daily correction, a dependable measure of control. Bowls of cereal, toast, fruit were set on the kitchen table by 8:15, which is when the red dots of our alarm clock palpitated. At this point, Imam Salim would sometimes feed the neighborhood cat he called Levi, short for Leviathan. Then we'd be downstairs, and before walking us to school, he'd ask how we slept and if we were well. Between the next 2 calls to prayer, because he was an imam at a mosque in Staten Island, he'd retreat into his office and indulge in yet another peculiar obsession: his written correspondence. He'd emerge at noon carrying legal and letter-sized envelopes and walk them back to the squat mailbox at the end of our block. On sick days and in the summer, we'd watch his routine and clamor to know who he was writing to. What phone-averse friend group could be so important as to warrant such devout maintenance? After some pressure, he said, "How do you know I'm not sustaining a resistance, an intifada, with nothing more than my stationery?" "Because you're not," we replied, unsure about the meanings of the word resistance, intifada, and even stationary. Following his mail run, he would perform his ablutions, call another adhan, the call to prayer, louder this time, and start the zuhr, or the afternoon prayer. He would do all this even if he were the only person in the mosque. "This is the job of the imam," he said. But he never made us pray, nor did he proselytize. When we were old enough to ask why he abstained from advocating for his God, even though that too was the job of an imam, he said, I have already performed all the conversions I can stomach. Regardless, we would line up behind him and mimic his prostrations. In truth, Imam Salim was a Sufi, a mystic, but he admitted it only once. He might have been an imam, but he did not consider religion a solve for society. To him, it could ever only be a means of disentangling the knots of oneself. The first time I read this, I went back and I read it again. And I was enchanted, intrigued, drawn in. I wanted to know Imam Salim. Later on, I found out that after the evening prayer, Imam Salim used to put a swig of whiskey in his nightly coffee. My sensibility told me a very terribly un-Imam thing to do. And here was this passionate, pious, political, complicated character leaping off from the book, out of the book, but not in a way that hankered after stereotypes, but actually left the whole conversation about stereotypes and what an imam should be or what a Muslim should be behind, and dealt with the human being in all of its complexity without taking religion or spirituality out of it. That it was all baked into this cake of this character, and to remove any part of it would be to undermine the beauty of the writing that Khalid gives us. The story is really complex, somewhere between fantasy, science fiction, and reality. We eventually learn of Imam Salim's past. We learn of his political activities in Saudi Arabia. We learn about his queerness and his sexuality. We learn about his friendships. We learn about his faith. We learn about his humanity. And in all of that, I am never forced or pressured as the reader to accept one of those things, but encouraged to accept all of those things. It's a masterful piece of work. And something that I've been so excited to read, because it spoke to me in this moment in a way that I thought a novel could not, because this is not a novel about Palestine. It's not a novel about Gaza. It's not a novel about this age of genocide. And yet, it is speaking to the ways in which narrative liberate us from the shibboleths of the oppressive systems of thought that we inhabit and live in. That literature has the power in these beautiful moments to take us beyond the moment we find ourselves in, into something liberating. Because embracing humanity has to be liberating. If we believe in liberation, then we must believe in the sanctity and of the whole of the human being and of all human beings. And particularly, we must find ourselves siding with those whose very humanity has been erased, or whose very humanity has been effaced, or whose very humanity has been eschewed, or whose very humanity has been turned into something else, into a mark of danger and exclusion. Which brings me to my conclusion. And thank you for staying with me a little longer than I intended. I am casting my eyes at John, and John is very relaxed right now. And so I'm going to take that as permission for just a few more moments. Just a few weeks ago, the Indian author Arundhati Roy won the 2024 Penn Pinter Prize. She made a very powerful speech against the genocide in Gaza and the complicity of Western powers in sustaining Israeli occupation. And yet, somewhere in that speech, she said two things which made me stop. And I was a bit heartbroken. I won't lie. I was a bit heartbroken. She said, "I am acutely aware that being the writer that I am, the non-Muslim that I am, and the woman that I am, it would be very difficult, perhaps impossible for me to survive very long under the rule of Hamas, Hezbollah, or the Iranian regime." A few moments later, speaking about these very movements and their connection to God, she says, because when all the powers of the world are against them, who do they have to turn to but God? There are two statements which I found deeply problematic. I know artists and writers in Gaza. We know that there's networks of all kinds of remarkable people, many of who have now been murdered. Institutions of music and learning and of art that have sent some artists into exile and other artists into oblivion. They all worked and lived in Gaza, even while there was a Hamas government there. The same can be said about South Lebanon and South Beirut, where artists and writers, creatives, intellectuals challenge and are engaged in deep, meaningful debate. Women, men, queer folk, all of them. This notion that somehow these places are incapable of embracing diversity despite the political difficulties that they're in, or the regimes or movements that are ascendant, to me is just a mark of intellectual laziness or pandering to a liberal elite idea. I respectfully disagree with Arundhati Roy on this. But it wasn't this first remark that got me, it was the second one. Because when all the powers of the world, she says, are against them, who do they have to turn to but God? God here for Arundhati Roy becomes the last resort. When all other politics and organizing and resistance fails, that's when God comes in. And that doesn't resonate with me at all. Nor does it resonate with the tradition that she is painting as a last resort. And this is part of the problem. And if there's nothing else that you leave with, please leave with this. Constructions of masculinity and manhood within this diverse, confusing, complicated ecosystem called Islam or the Islamic tradition always finds its root back to what? Love. If I go back to the words of the Prophet Muhammad, I'm reminded of a time when the Prophet was sitting with one of his companions, another man. And another male companion walked by, and the person who was sitting with the Prophet said, "O Messenger of God, I love that man." And the Prophet said to him, "Have you told him that you love him?" And he said, "No, I haven't told him." He says, "Tell him." And so the person sitting next to the Prophet got up and ran after this person and said, and caught up with him and said, "I love you for the sake of God." And the person to whom he said this said, "May the one for whose sake you love me also love you." I find in my own tradition, unforced, but part of the way in which I experienced my tradition growing up, I experienced a faith that was deeply grounded in love and the expression of love and service and of care. That service and care, that emphasis on mercy, the emblematic quality of my faith was something I turned to often. My name is Abdul-Rehman. My parents gave it to me as a gift. It means slave of the merciful one. They forever bid that I would spend my life in service to the merciful one, and for that I will thank them for all eternity. We were taught by these lessons that Muslim masculinity is rooted in compassion, care, and fraternity. That even the Quranic calls to the protection of women is to protect society from male predation, from misogyny and patriarchy, so we can all be human together. And in particular for me, there's a particular story, a particular sacrifice, which in our Islamic traditions, Shia traditions and Sunni traditions emerges. And that is the sacrifice of the Prophet's grandson, Imam Hussein, on the fields of Karbala, Iraq. In Islamic history, Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, led an uprising against the illegitimate dynastic rule of the Umayyad dynasty. He, as a member of the Prophet's family, could not countenance an authority that did not appeal to faith and faithfulness, but rather appealed to blood and dynastic lineage. And so he massed an army to challenge Yazid, the caliph at the time. And the story is known by Muslims of every variety, that on the plains of Karbala, on the 10th day of the lunar calendar month Muharram, Imam Hussein, the Prophet's grandson, was murdered and martyred by fellow Muslims. In a political act, in a rupturous act that eventually created two distinct traditions in the Islamic ecosystem, but also lives with us as a moment of profound heartbreak. In his recent book, The Ethics of Karbala, Cyrus Ali Zargar offers us this. When we look at the narratives of Karbala, of Hussein rising up against the oppressor, men, he says, weep profusely. They weep at the loss of friends and family or at the injustice wrought upon Hussein. In ancient Greek heroism, that of Homer's Iliad, men wept over the loss of friends too, as did their horses. Their masculinity was not at risk for such weeping. Part of what interests me in these narratives, as Zargar says, is their ability to foster masculinities and femininities that thrive in settings of selflessness, yet also experience deeply expressed emotions. One last quote and then we'll finish. Zargar continues and says, the reader will have noticed throughout that the warrior functions as a caretaker, imbued with love for God as well as for those around him. Many commentators on the Karbala tragedy associate the virtues of Hussein and the warriors who fell alongside him with a certain kind of loving masculinity, identified as manliness. The word is muruwa in Arabic, or mardan nigi in the Persian texts. That masculinity is clearly a merciful one, a soft counterpoint to the cowardly, rule-bound masculinity of Hussein's opponents. It is the manliness of Amir Abdul-Qadir fighting the French, caring for his sick enemies, the very French forces that have raped and mutilated his people. Amir Abdul-Qadir was the leader of the early resistance against the French in North Africa. It is the manliness of Amir Abdul-Qadir, to finish the sentence, caring for his sick enemies, the very French forces that have raped and mutilated his people in opposition to the vindictive masculinity that one finds in the Islamist propaganda that held our attention so closely in the 2000s. My dear friends, it is time, I believe, in our literature and in our approach, and it behooves us in this genocide moment to unpack the deeply held visions and stereotypes that we have, not only about the racialized black and brown Muslim man, but all of those shibboleths that prevent us from recognizing, embracing, diving into one another's humanity. It is not about political difference, we will have it. It is not about condemnation of oppression, we will do it. It is not about fighting and resisting injustice, that will happen. But let that be based on principle and ethics, the loving masculinity that I believe Zargar speaks to in me and in the tradition that I know. On Eid this past year in Gaza, journalist Hani Abdul-Razak stood along a street offering a rose to every person who had lost someone during the ongoing genocide. Some of you saw that. As people were coming for prayers, he was giving roses to those who had suffered loss. As people made their way to and from Eid prayers, the roses quickly ran out, but the sentiment behind them did not. Here was a young Palestinian man, a journalist, amidst unimaginable grief, offering a small mark of beauty in the face of staggering loss. It was a quiet, poignant affirmation of humanity, one that stood in defiance of the violence engulfing his community. Just earlier this month, the same journalist, Hani Abdul-Razak, was credited by Reuters Media as the photographer who captured the death of Shaban al-Daloum, the young man whose picture was broadcast around the world as he burned to death in his family's tent beside the bombed Al-Aqsa Martyrs Hospital in Gaza. Abu Razak's lens documented a moment of unspeakable horror, a death that reflected the destruction of not just bodies, but the very fabric of Palestinian life. How can literature, story, and the written word help us contend with such horror? How do we question the humanity of Palestinian or Muslim men when the very concept of humanity is systematically denied them? Through acts of resistance, both large and small, from offering roses to documenting tragedy, Palestinian men like Hani Abdul-Razak assert their humanity despite a world determined to erase it. This story sits at the intersection of beauty and loss, life and death, reminding us that amidst the violence, the spirit of those who resist through humanity endures. In returning to Othello, I reflect on the ways in which Muslim masculinity has been pathologized, racialized, and dehumanized through modern history. Othello's tragedy, again, is he internalizes the very violence and fear that his Venetian society projects onto him. He becomes the dangerous Moor that they have always feared. And we are offered other models of Muslim masculinity, more germane and more true, ones that are rooted in love, care, and divine responsibility. To interrogate Muslim manhood in a time of mass death is for us to challenge the dehumanization that continues to shape how the Muslim male body is seen, whether in Gaza or in literature or on the streets of Lancaster or in our everyday lives. It is a call to myself and to you to reclaim a narrative of love, mercy, and justice, and to resist the forces that seek to strip us of our humanity. Palestinian men, the Muslim male body, the racialized black and brown body, is fully human, as fathers, as sons, as brothers, as resistors, as creators of community. But actually, we don't need any of these adjectives. The Palestinian male body, all Palestinian bodies, the Muslim male body, black and brown male bodies, all human bodies have value because they're human. Why, in our discourses, do we need to qualify humanity? Why do we spend our energies qualifying humanity when our energies would be better spent challenging the systems that dehumanize? Thank you very much for your patience and for listening. A big thank you to John. And all of you for your patience with me this evening. My apologies for going so over time. Thank you so much for being here.
I won't attempt to respond other than to say there will be drinks there. If you need facilities, they're around that way.